20 minutes. That was how long it lasted. 20 minutes of a press conference that nobody in that room will forget quickly. 20 minutes of carefully chosen words and long pauses and attention that built so gradually that by the time it reached its peak, everyone sitting in front of him had already stopped breathing normally. And then Shohei Ohtani slammed his hand on the table, stood up, and walked out. The room didn't erupt. It didn't fill with noise the way rooms do when something chaotic happens. It went the other direction entirely. It went so quiet that the sound of the door closing behind him felt like a thunderclap. Nobody moved for a moment. Nobody spoke. Because what had just happened in that room was not a tantrum. It was not a performance. It was not the kind of stage drama that athletes sometimes use to control a narrative. What had just happened was something far more rare and far more unsettling. It was the truth, finally reaching its limit. Let's go back to the beginning of those 20 minutes. Because the ending only makes sense if you understand what came before it. The ending only carries its full weight if you were in the room from the start, or if someone walks you through it carefully enough that you can feel the temperature rising the way the people sitting in those chairs felt it rising. Ohtani arrived at the press conference with the kind of composure that has become his public signature. Controlled. Present. Giving nothing away before he is ready to give it. He sat down. He adjusted the microphone slightly. He folded his hands on the table in front of him in that particular way he has, not stiff, not performative, just settled. And then he looked at the room. And something in his expression was different. The reporters who cover him regularly noticed it immediately. They have spent enough time studying this face, across press conferences and post-game interviews and the brief exchanges that happen at the edges of practice, to know when the version of Ohtani sitting in front of them is the public version and when it is something closer to the real one. This was the real one. The room felt it before he said a single word. The 3 volumes of medical records had been released that morning. That is where the day actually began. Not at the press conference. Not with the GM's announcement. Not with Ohtani's entrance into a room full of cameras and recorders and people holding notebooks. It began in the quiet of an office somewhere inside the Dodgers organization, where someone made the decision that the information could no longer be managed in pieces. 3 volumes. The kind of documentation that doesn't accumulate quickly. The kind that represents not just a single procedure or a single diagnosis but a timeline, months of examination, treatment, re-examination, decision-making, course correction. The kind of medical record that, when released in full, tells a story that is more complicated than any version that had been shared publicly before. The right knee. That was the center of it. That was what those 3 volumes circled back to, again and again, in the language of doctors and medical staff that translates awkwardly into the language of baseball but translates completely into the language of worry. The right knee had been the subject of treatment. Had been the subject of monitoring. Had been the subject of the careful, guarded conversations that happen between a player and his medical team when the information is too important to be casual about and too sensitive to be fully public. Until today. Today it became public. And Ohtani walked into that press conference knowing exactly what was in those 3 volumes. Knowing exactly what the reporters in front of him had spent the morning reading. Knowing that the conversation he was about to have was one that could not be navigated with the usual careful distance. He sat down. He folded his hands. And the first question came. It was straightforward. Almost gentle, by the standards of a press conference where everyone in the room knew what the morning had contained. Shohei, after the release of your medical records today, can you walk us through what's been happening with your right knee? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the reporter who had asked the question for a moment that lasted just slightly longer than comfortable. Not with hostility. Not with the look of someone who resents being asked. With the look of someone who has been waiting for this question for longer than today, who has known it was coming and has spent some portion of that waiting time deciding exactly how honest to be when it arrived. Then he began to speak. I want to be clear about something first, he said. His voice was even, measured. The translator worked beside him, but something in Ohtani's tone needed no translation. There are things that were reported about my condition that were not complete. I want to correct that today. The room shifted. When Shohei Ohtani uses the word correct at a press conference, the room shifts. Because he does not use that word carelessly. He does not invite confrontation with the way his situation has been publicly described unless the gap between what has been said and what is true has become too wide to leave alone. The gap, apparently, had become too wide. He spoke for the first several minutes about the treatment itself. Not in the vague language of ongoing maintenance and standard procedure that athletic organizations reach for when they want to acknowledge something without illuminating it. He spoke with a specificity that surprised everyone in the room, details about what the treatment had involved, how long it had been ongoing, what the right knee had been through in the months leading up to this moment. The reporters stopped raising their hands. They just listened. Because when someone who has been carefully managing information suddenly stops managing it, when the door that has been held just slightly open is finally pushed all the way, you do not interrupt that. You do not reach for your next question. You sit still and you receive what is being given while it is being given. Ohtani was giving something real. And the room understood the value of letting it arrive without interference. The GM's announcement came in the middle of all of it. Not in the middle of the press conference, it had been released separately, earlier in the day, timed with the medical records in the way that significant organizational announcements are timed when the people releasing them want the information to land as a package rather than in fragments. The date for Ohtani's return to pitching had been officially announced. A specific date. Not sometime this summer or we're targeting a certain window or any of the other carefully imprecise language that organizations use when they want to suggest progress without committing to it. A date. Concrete. On the calendar. The kind of announcement that, once made, cannot be walked back without consequence. For the Dodgers, making that announcement on the same day the medical records were released was not an accident. It was a statement. It was the organization saying, here is the full picture. Here is what has been happening. And here is what comes next. But Ohtani, sitting at that table, had his own relationship with the date that had just been announced. And it was more complicated than the press release suggested. Somewhere around the 12-minute mark, the questions shifted. They had moved through the treatment details, through the medical timeline, through the careful and surprisingly candid account Ohtani had been giving of what his right knee had been through. And now a reporter, not aggressively, but directly, asked the question that connected everything. The GM has announced a return date for your pitching. Is that date something you agreed to? Or is that a date that was set around you? The room went very still. It was the question underneath all the other questions. It was the question that the 3 volumes of medical records, read carefully, had seemed to be pointing toward. It was the question about the distance, if any distance existed, between what Shohei Ohtani believed about his own body and what the organization had decided to tell the public about it. Ohtani looked at the reporter. His hands, still folded on the table in front of him, pressed slightly more firmly against each other. It was a small movement. The kind that you would miss if you were not watching closely. The kind that the people who were watching closely did not miss. He began to answer. His voice was still even. Still measured. But underneath the measurement, something else was present now. Something that had been building since he sat down, since he said the word correct, since he began giving details that had not been shared before. He spoke about the return date. About his conversations with the medical staff. About what he believed his knee was capable of and what the process of arriving at a date had looked like from the inside. He was precise. He was clear. And he was, unmistakably, saying something different from what the official announcement had implied. Not contradicting it entirely. Not dismantling it publicly in a way that would create an organizational crisis in front of every camera in the room. But threading a distinction through his answer that was impossible to miss if you were listening for it. The date existed. But the conversation around the date had not been as simple as the press release suggested. The reporter followed up. "Are you comfortable with that date?" 4 words. Ohtani looked at the table for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked back up. And what happened in the next 30 seconds happened fast enough that the people in the room spent the rest of the day trying to reconstruct it in the right order. His voice changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that could be described as losing control. But the measurement disappeared from it. The careful calibration that had carried him through 12 minutes of honest and unusually specific answers gave way to something more direct. More final. He said what he needed to say. And then his hand came down on the table. Not violently. Not in a way that scattered objects or shocked the room with its force. But with a weight and a deliberateness that was entirely different from the accidental sound of something falling. It was intentional. It was controlled. It was the physical expression of a sentence that words alone had not been sufficient to complete. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the room for just a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the expression of someone who has said the thing that needed to be said and does not need to be in the room for whatever comes next. And he walked out. The door closed. Nobody moved. The cameras kept rolling because cameras do not process shock the way humans do. The recorders kept recording. But the people, the reporters who had been in that room for 20 minutes watching something unfold that none of them had fully anticipated, sat with it for a long moment before anyone reached for a phone or turned to a colleague or began the process of converting what they had witnessed into words. Because some moments resist that conversion. Some moments ask to be felt before they are filed. The Dodgers organization responded within the hour. The statement was careful. Respectful. It acknowledged Ohtani's comments without directly addressing the distinction he had drawn between his own assessment and the announced timeline. It used the language that organizations use when they need to say something without saying too much, expressing confidence in the process, expressing gratitude for Ohtani's transparency, reaffirming commitment to his health as the primary consideration. It did not mention the table. It did not mention the walkout. Those things did not need to be addressed in a statement because they had already communicated everything they needed to communicate in the room where they happened. Later, a reporter who had been present was asked to describe the moment. She paused for a long time before answering. "It didn't feel like anger," she said finally. "It felt like someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally decided that carrying it quietly wasn't working anymore." She paused again. He didn't storm out. He walked out. There's a difference. Storming out is emotion. Walking out is decision. Shohei Ohtani made a decision today. He decided that 20 minutes of truth was enough. That 3 volumes of medical records deserved a press conference that matched their honesty. That the gap between what had been said publicly about his right knee and what he knew about it had become too wide to manage with careful language and guarded answers. He sat down. He told the truth. And when the truth had been told as completely as he was willing to tell it in that room on that day, he stood up. He straightened his jacket. And he walked out. No announcement necessary. No final statement. No more secrets. Just the sound of a door closing behind the most complicated, most extraordinary, most quietly furious athlete in baseball. And a room full of people trying to figure out what had just happened. And what it meant for everything that comes next.